Hey, I'm Brian from Vexagon, and I want to talk about audio and sound. I've been interested and passionate about sound and the science behind it since I was a kid. I've been recording more than half my life, and I'm 31 now. So, I want to talk about two things in this first video: wavelengths, waveforms, and the frequency spectrum. Second, I'm going to start um, with what waveforms are. And yeah, if you chart an XY graph just like this, if your y-axis is amplitude, which is kind of like volume, but it's not. We'll get to that. Hope you can read that at all. And your x-axis is time. It's necessary to bisect the y-axis like this. I'll explain that in just a second. A sine wave, which correlates to the sine function, if you're familiar with pre-calc at all, looks something like this. Unlike my drawing, it's perfectly smooth, and it repeats in a perfect pattern forever, no matter what the frequency is. The frequency with this unit of time is how quickly this cycle happens. If from here to the first cycle, or if from the origin, which is the beginning, to this point, if this is a tenth of a second, then you have 10 of these in 1 second happening, and you would call that 10 hertz. Sorry, I had to cough. This length, this distance of time from origin to the cycle repeating, this is called the period of this wavelength. The wavelength of a certain frequency is defined as the number of times the cycle happens within 1 second. So if it happens 10 times in a second, then you have a 10 hertz frequency. Hertz is the unit of measurement, and the period of that wavelength would be a tenth of a second. Explanation for the shape. If you started out with a particle such as the air, and it were to move in one direction, this chart would simply be a line extending in one direction indefinitely. Bill Hicks, the comedian, public speaker, once said that he took a bunch of mushrooms and realized that all matter is just energy condensed into a slow vibration. I think that's pretty accurate, and the air in this situation with sound is oscillating back and forth. It is vibrating ever so slightly. It's obviously visually imperceptible, but our ears detect these changes and these movements in the air. It's an interesting philosophical concept to wonder whether sound really exists, empirically, provably outside of the human sense of it. Anyway, this is a sine wave. It's smooth, as stated. There are generally four different types of sound waves. This one sounds very smooth. I won't attempt to imitate it, but it's a perfectly smooth and pleasing tone, and it's pure. If you hear a sine wave at a certain frequency, you are hearing only that frequency. You can have what are called square waves. I'm just going to draw over this, and a square wave looks like this. These are created by digital technology. These don't exist in nature. As a matter of fact, perfect sine waves basically don't exist in nature. They're a theoretical concept. Almost nothing in nature is going to be pure in that way. You can have, excuse me a second, you can have those two kinds. You can have a sawtooth wave, which goes like this. And it is, again, you can see the rigidity of the shape. Some synthesizers use these kinds of shapes. And then you can have something, you can have a waveform that doesn't repeat and has an irregular shape that can be called noise or categorized as noise, and it will literally just look like whatever and not repeat and not have a consistent shape. One interesting fact about sound waves, and we'll get to this and transition into talking about the frequency spectrum. Sorry, I've very loosely planned this out. Is that when you have frequency means how often or how frequently that shape or that particle is oscillating. So a higher frequency means that it's moving faster in a given unit of time. Something can be moving like this. It's a much longer period, much lower wavelength, because in the same unit of time, this waveform from here over is moving much slower. That is a low frequency. This would be a relatively high frequency compared to this one. In the A frequency, that cycle's happening very quickly. With the B frequency, a good example of this in daily life is that if you've ever been around what boomers call a thumper car, or a car that has a really loud or bass-heavy sound system, an interesting fact that I don't know if most owners of those cars are aware of, but the lowest frequencies coming out of those cars are actually louder outside the car than they are inside the car, because the amplitudes are so high. This would be a low amplitude without much happening, and this would be a high one, because it's, like I said, it's basically volume. The wavelengths are so long that they don't have time physically in space to complete that cycle before they are outside the physical space of the car. So they're passing through the ground in the car and so forth before they are really being manifested fully. So it's louder for folks outside than it is inside. So they may not realize how loud it is, or they may, whatever. That is the bare bones basics of wavelengths. And the frequency spectrum. There's two things. The shapes of waveforms and the frequency spectrum are intrinsically tied and inseparable. Human hearing starts at 20 hertz. There is no hope of anyone reading that ever. Okay, I need to write bigger. And tops out about 20K, 20,000 hertz. I'm gonna write this big. Cool. You can kind of see that. The important and often overlooked or whatever fact about frequencies is that from 20 hertz to 40 hertz, a doubling, is 1 octave. Those frequencies are 1 octave apart. Then, from 40 hertz to 80 hertz, that is another octave. If you know anything about math, you know this is exponential increase, and you get to a point where, like from out here, you have 3,000 hertz, and then the next octave is 3,000 hertz away. It's 6K. And so on. You can kind of fill in the middle there. To visualize exponential increase, instead of being a straight line like that, exponential increase is like this. That is how the frequency spectrum works. There's a lot more material, a lot more potential. Sorry. Up here, a lot more content than there is down here. At least there's a larger number of frequencies. An interesting fact, and this is useful to know when recording, human hearing is at its very best right around 3K, right here. This is the peak. You can divide this up with mixing and listening and things in different ways, but you can say this here, something like a bass drum will probably occupy a space that looks kind of like this in this area. This will be mostly where the harmonic content of that sound will be. There are no organic sounds in the world that have shapes like that, where they're one frequency spectrum. They're one notch of the frequency spectrum. That doesn't happen. What happens is, something like this. You can have all kinds of different shapes. You can have things that go like this and then kind of shelf off. You can have anything in the world, but that happens because of something called harmonics. When one sound is made, even you can do this in practice with a stringed instrument. If you tune two of the strings to the same note, or if you have two notes that are an octave apart, the same note being an octave apart. If you fret or hold down or whatever, say the higher note, whichever one, but you're not playing it and it's muted, but it's held down where it can be played, and you play the lower note. If you mute the lower note, you'll find that higher string is ringing, because the air was vibrating at the resonant frequency of the higher string. And if you have more of them, they'll all ring. The interesting thing happens, that's called sympathetic vibration, by the way. Something interesting happens if you can talk about interval for frequency, interval theory at a different time, but if you were to hold a note that is basically halfway between those, called a fifth, you'd also have sympathetic vibrations with that note, but they wouldn't be as strong. So anyway, when you have a fundamental frequency, which is the fundamental of whatever is happening, you also have harmonics around it. That's why you have this bell shape with the sound, because if this is the fundamental frequency, you have this amplitude of these sounds, and then, or these frequencies, and then as you go over, you have less, and you have less, and you have less until it dissipates. That shape is what gives each sound its character and its flavor. When you're mixing and processing things, if you have a shape that is like that, you can do things like, see, this one just happens that it is, fundamental frequency is around 3K. If whatever this sound is in your mix, this sound isolated, or this sound, sorry, in context with everything playing, if it is too far forward and you feel like it's sticking out too much, you can turn it down, which would mean dropping this entire shape vertically, or you can reshape it depending on what else is happening. One of the easiest ways to let something stay in a mix, but to reshape it, is to do something like this. Not a hard cut, but to reduce, or even you can just put a dip right at 3K, or anywhere. It doesn't have 3Ks, I've already mentioned, but you can look at, you can sort of analyze what your mix looks like at a given time. And if you've got a spot, like say this one, where there's something that's kind of sticking up and that's noticeable, if you want it to be noticeable, leave it. And then everything else, or specific intentional other things, when you're looking at put them on, you're looking at frequencies they're putting out, you would actually put a dip in the same spot, go to everything else, scoop it, scoop it, scoop it, so that one thing will be farther forward. I could say more, but I don't want to belabor this too much. I'll talk about other things in another video.